The HR Stories podcast is brought to you by the team at HR Stories. The team at HR Stories helps businesses, nonprofits better manage the employee experience, providing the tools, training, and resources they need to take their organization to the next level. To learn more, go to our website, thehrStoriesTeam.com. Each week on the HR Stories podcast, management and HR consultants Chuck Samicki and John Paulheimer dive into the stories that matter to small business owners, nonprofit leaders, and HR professionals. We continue to be amazed at how companies allow poor decision-making, lack of knowledge, and in some cases, hubris to cause harm to their organization. Each week, we discuss stories where companies must pay large fines, lose great talent, or even stain their reputation within this community. And we tell you how to avoid that same fate. Welcome to HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story. On this week's episode, John and Chuck discuss constructive discharge and how in the HR world, simple things can turn complex. In 1998, Nancy Saunders was arrested by her supervisor and thrown in jail. And that's just where the story starts. Stay tuned to find out why Nancy was in jail and how this matters to HR. But first, here's what's happening in the HR news.
John, great to see you this morning. Great to hear you. There is a lot happening in the news. And I like during the introduction, you say hubris. That's such a good term. You know, it's and I think what you're trying to say is companies sometimes just don't think it can happen to them type of thing, or people don't think things can happen to them, or they don't want to pay attention to laws and they think they know better. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but I love that term.
Oh, good. Yeah. Hubris. It means prideful, over prideful, where you make these decisions. It's a great Shakespearean term. I used back in my theater days, and I really do think some companies are like, oh, I'm above the law, I'm better, and this never going to happen to me, or, oh, we can do it, we're doing it the right way, and they don't think about the circumstances to their employees, they don't think about the circumstances to their shareholders, and then they end up running in trouble. So that's it. What's going on in the news? What have you been hearing? What have you been paying attention to?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of great things going on. In fact, there's so many things that it's just hard to keep track of. But luckily, we have the HR Stories podcast for folks. And I'm really interested, and I'm really trying to follow the FTC guidelines for non-competes.
Oh,
and and so I know when we think of HR and HR law, employment law, I think of what? The EEOC, the Department of Labor. I think of OSHA.
Wage and Hour Division.
I might think
National Labor Relations Board.
ICE, Immigration Control, Homeland Security. But I never think of FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. But they're weighing in here, and for a lot of our listeners may wonder, well, what does the FTC have to do with HR? Well, the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, regulates commerce in the United States, and they feel that non-compete agreements that companies have and produce for employees, and sometimes high-level employees, but sometimes middle-level employees and such, create a barrier to commerce, the intercourse of commerce going back and forth. If you have a non-compete on someone, that means that they cannot move from company to company. The FTC sees that as a break in trade, in commerce, and therefore they have weighed in, and they have a notice of proposed rulemaking to address non-compete agreements. And the comment period closed as of April 19th. So we as employers and podcasters and consultants are now on standby for that final rule. So it's going to be really interesting, John.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it's interesting. I was actually talking about this in my class yesterday. And what I think is, and I mean, they were pretty strong with it, like just get rid of non-competes altogether. And I don't think that is completely realistic, but I always tell the story of there was a company, a restaurant in some small town in the Midwest where there was a grill cook, and they put on a non-compete. So he could not go and work in any of the restaurants in that small town. And so basically he had to move to work. And it was ridiculous, right, for a grill cook to have a non-compete. On the other hand, when I worked at QVC, we had hosts, right? And we would train those hosts, and we'd get those hosts there. And we didn't want them to leave QVC, go to another electronic retailer, and we lose all of that connection with our audience, right? They would go over there. And so we had a 1 year, I think it was, non-compete for anybody in the talent organization, right? And so always interesting. Non-compete's going to be interesting. I'm hoping they come out with really common sense guidelines, that it's not like just no non-competes. I think that would go too far.
Yeah, well, the way it's looking right now is that there could be a total ban on non-competes, even as far as, and I've seen some people out there talking about, some thought leaders, not that we're not thought leaders, John, but there are some thought leaders that are saying the proposed rule declares all non-compete clauses unfair competition, and that's how they're viewing this. But it would also ban, and could look at banning, even those training situations. Let's say you sign someone and you hire them and you say, we're going to pay for some sort of training or a training repayment agreement. And if it requires the worker to stay there for a certain amount of time or repay, it could actually, depending on how things are interpreted, it could actually affect that. And I'm going to tell you a quick story. I was working on a handbook, and that's one of our things we love to do here at the team of HR Stories. We love handbooks, love looking at them, dissecting them. And so I was helping a company write their handbook. And one of the final things they said to me before it went to the attorney, they said, because after we do the handbooks, John, we always want it reviewed by an attorney. We always suggest that. And they said, we're going to ask our attorney to put a clause in there. And these are low-level positions, working at a company that rents out industrial type of equipment, mechanics and things like that, that if an employee quits to go work for a competitor, we are going to terminate them immediately and cancel any vacation accrual or PT accrual they have. So they're okay to leave, but they're going to leave immediately, and we're not paying out their vacation. That's only if they go, even if they give us 2 weeks notice, that's only if they go to a competitor. And I said, I'll be interested to see what the lawyer says about that, especially with the upcoming FTC proposed rule on non-competes.
Yeah. That's interesting. That gets into a lot of that. And I think one of the things, listeners, that you really want to think about, if you are going to put in there, like, hey, if you're going to leave our company, you're not going to get your accrued vacation. Be very careful, because every state has different laws around that. And so some states require you to pay that accrued vacation. They see it as earned for that employee. And so you want to make sure that you do that. And so that's important, right? And kind of making sure that you do that. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what he says, right? And then the whole non-compete, I didn't even think about the non-compete thing as well. I worked for a manufacturing company, and because of the manufacturing company and what we did a lot of defense work. If you gave your notice, you were walked out the door.
Yeah.
There was no 2 week, and we would pay them for 2 weeks. We would walk them out the door. So as soon as you gave your notice, you would walk out the door. So everyone knew that, right? After a while, everyone knew that. And so they would come on a Friday, and they would start their new job on a Monday, and then they would get 2 weeks of severance pay. But that's all right. And we just, because of the way we did it, that was fine.
Sure.
So,
well, there's a lot to watch with this, especially because there are a lot of different intricacies. There's a safe harbor law for low wage workers where you wouldn't be able to do anything if they make a certain amount or less. But then there are some protections for companies if there are trade secrets or things like that. So there are some things there. But that's my big story that that I'm following outside of all the other things that are going on with sexual harassment. And it's interesting. I'm just going to share this with you. And this is part of our story today, is that the EEOC rep that I was, when I was reading a little bit about some of the new stuff, they said the EEOC, despite all of the things that are going on, they're still seeing an increase in sexual harassment complaints. So I thought that was kind of interesting too.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I think people are, because of forced arbitration is going away, I think people are more willing to step up and say, hey, this is happening to me. So we're hearing more people do that. I think people feel more comfortable with doing that. And so we'll see. I think we'll see more. I think it'll continue to go up for a period of time until companies get better at addressing it, right? Because I think in the past, companies were not aware. And I mean, again, I think that's, we could get into why they weren't aware and that kind of stuff, but they weren't aware of it because people didn't feel comfortable. I think it was, the statistic is was going underreported. I don't know what it is now, but it was going underreported by about 80%. And that those individuals that were coming forward and talking about it, 75% were people were being retaliated, which kind of goes into our story today. Hint, hint. And so, right. And so I think that, when you hear those stories and you're like, you talk to people and they're like, oh yeah, I went forward and I gotten this and this happened over here. And you're less likely to go there. And a lot of people, especially in today's market, they just leave. They're like, look, I'm not going to put up with this. I'm going to go somewhere else. And it doesn't solve the problem. They don't mention it in an exit interview. They don't sue you. They just move on because it's not worth it for them and they don't want to deal with it. And so you still have that person in your workplace that's doing it and people don't want to approach it. So
what do you got, John? What's going on in the news? What caught your eye this week?
I got a couple good news stories. So I want to get you kind of, we're always like, oh, these companies are doing terrible things, blah, blah, blah. And so this is a kind of good news story, right? It is a good news story that progress is being made, maybe not fast enough, but Walmart just released some of their statistics and they now have more women and people of color have made it their way into senior leadership positions at Walmart USA corporate headquarters. And it's really interesting. I worked with, when I was at QVC, we pulled over an executive from Walmart. I forgot what title was. She ended up being our CEO, the CEO of our US branch. And she was fascinated, smart, intelligent, really, really great leader for the organization. And so approachable, right? People could just go and talk to her and she was always there for them. All right. And so in Walmart's 2023 Culture, Diversity, and Equity Inclusion Report, which they do as part of their shareholder information, this year, women comprised 30% of the officers, which, okay, when you look at that number, 37% is not good. We know that there are more female workers overall in the workplace than male. So they're still not up there, but that's above 32% in 2022. So they made a 5% increase, which is good. And then about 28% of U.S. officers are people of color compared to 25% in 2022. More Asian and Hispanic talent also now work at Walmart, the report says, right? And so notably, the global representation of women in Walmart leadership position has increased despite the mass exodus of women from workforce following the coronavirus pandemic onset. So I thought that was an interesting story. I know we're always like, this company's not doing anything this well. I love Walmart's, right, the biggest employer in the United States. And so they're making gains in this area. Obviously, there's a lot more to do. I would see, though, over time, if we think about their employee base, and as their employee base changes to be more female-centric, we're going to see more females rising in that organization to be leadership. And I would probably say 10 or 15 years, maybe even less than 10 years, I would expect that it's 50-50, if not more women in leading that company than now. And I think that would be great for them because their customer base, I would guess, I don't know this for a fact, what is probably 60%, maybe 70% women. But I don't know that for a fact. But it would be so I'm kind of doing that. So that's one big good news story. The other big news story that I found is Thomson Reuters. So you know Thomson Reuters. They have something in common with us, Chuck. Do you know Thomson Reuters?
Are they like a news service or something like that?
Kind of, right? And so they have been around for a long time, and they really started doing researches on business and having business information and providing you information. So their tagline is world-class content. See, I told you they had something in content.
Yes, there you go.
And technology empowering today's most informed professionals. And so they want to get information into leaders' hands so they can make better decisions. So that's what they do. We do that with HR. So maybe there's a partnership there now that I mention it. But they have not only offices throughout the United States, right? So they have offices throughout the United States, which we know can complicate HR, right? And so if you have an office in New York City, you got to think about the employment laws in New York City. If you have an office in California, what are the employment laws there, right? And so they look at that. Plus, they're global, right? And so they have offices around the world. And so they were looking at how do we create a clear parental leave program, right? And not have it patchworked in there. And so they came up, and in April of 2023, Thomson Reuters employers will receive 16 weeks of paid parental leave. So if they need it, they get 16 weeks of parental leave. And so I gotta say, I know this is like, oh, that's, a lot of small businesses can't compete with that, right? We just can't. We're small businesses. We can't compete with that. But I do see this trend in terms of talent acquisition. Parental leave is a big thing. And that's where the big companies come in and go, look, we can do this. We can figure this out. And they did it across the board. And I think it's a great thing for the employees of Thomson Reuters. I do think it's going to be hard for small business owners when we're thinking about, all right, well, how do I compete for that talent? What is those things I can do? And I definitely think we talk about that in some of our retention classes, but there are things we can do to overcome that. And so just be aware of doing that. So I just thought those are two good news stories that I heard.
Yeah, high impact, low effort things. And when I say low effort, yes, things still cost money, but there are, it's that the cost of returns or whatever. Like you do something little, it might cost you several $1,000s, but it's going to save you or make you 5, 10, 15 times more money on the back end in saving on retention. So I love those stories.
Yeah, there's one story. I had somebody in one of my classes, one of my workshops once, and we were talking about retention and that kind of stuff. And she was in the automobile service industry. So they worked on cars and that kind of stuff. And she had a perk for all her employees that they could work on their cars for free after work hours if they wanted to come in and work on their cars for free. And she said because of that perk, her employee retention was over 5 years.
Yeah, I believe it.
It was just that perk. Now, there's some costs, right? There's some liability, of course. You have people working after hours, so there's going to be some liability costs there that had to pay. There's probably like oil and lubricants and that kind of stuff that they would probably have to pay. But the tools, you're using them anyway, right? So there's maybe a little wear and tear on the tools. But the cost is so small, to your point, and that retention cost is so much better that it made sense for them to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I got one more story, John. It's one that you threw towards me, and it's in relation to today's big story. Okay. And we follow Eric Meyer, the Employer Handbook, the lawyer out of Philadelphia. He's always got some great stuff, and
Eagles go.
Well, apparently, and you sent this to me, there's 4 federal agencies recently announced that they are ready to police unlawful bias, unlawful discrimination, and other harmful outcomes when it comes to AI. And the 4 federal agencies are the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. They issued a joint statement this week, and I'll tell you, I'll put that in the show notes below.
Yeah.
In regards to AI. And I just want to share with our audience that I have used ChatGPT AI on a couple of I played with it. Okay, hey, tell me this, tell me that. What do you think about that? So to research our story today, I thought, well, let me see if ChatGPT can add any input on a story, an example. So I said, hey, and I laid in what our topics were, and it came back with this fantastic story, John. It was amazing. I was like, this is a great story.
You got hook and sinker into it, right?
Oh, yeah. It was like, this is exactly what I was looking for. Everything. I'm like, I'm just going to plug and play. But I thought, maybe I better do some research. And guess what I found out?
It was completely false. That's what I'm guessing from what you're saying.
Yeah, the people were real people. The location was a real location, Penn State University, but the story was completely fabricated. And these two people, there was nothing in relation to this story, to what the background said these folks were. And so then I told ChatGPT, I said, that's incorrect. And it came back, it said, oh, you know what? I think you're right. This is literally, I think you're right. Here, does this story fit? It was the same story, two other people. And I couldn't even confirm who those people were, if they were real. So folks, you've got to be careful when you use this AI, this ChatGPT. You cannot take it for absolute facts. In fact, and I'll just tell you one more story, and then I know we're going to need to take a break, John. I was going to do a class on sexual harassment for a client in Wisconsin. So we're going to travel to Wisconsin. So obviously there are ways, and we have resources to find out the Wisconsin laws and sexual harassment. But I thought, let me ask ChatGPT. ChatGPT AI, tell me about the Wisconsin sexual harassment laws.
I don't know how many times I've told you, Chuck. How many times have I told you, be careful with AI because it's biased?
And it came up with this big, long, Wisconsin, boom, 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 boom. I'm like, really? That sounds like California or New York or some other state. So I did, I double checked and I'm like, that's not true. So I told ChatGPT that's not true. And it said, oh yeah, you're right. Sorry. I mean, I'm telling you, there's a lot of great things with this, but there are a lot of crazy stories like that.
Yeah. And I think, artificial intelligence is great. And we're definitely, look, it's going to impact all of us going forward, right? It's going to impact us going forward. And it's definitely something Chuck and I have been talking about behind the scenes. We're definitely going to come up, do an episode on it, talk about it, really dive into it. And really just kind of talk to you guys about how it's going to impact HR, because I think it's important. But boy, be very careful using it, because what it does, right? Just think about this. It scours all the information available to it and says, this seems right. We can do the same thing, right? When we go to our search engines and, put in, I need the laws in Wisconsin. If we're not careful, we may get the wrong laws and the wrong things, right? And so Chuck and I have spent our careers making sure that we try to give the right information at the right time, and make sure that you have that. And so I think that's great. Listen, Chuck, we are way past our time limit. Let's take a break, because I want to get into your story, because I think this story, although it's a very, very specific point, it's going to be a very good point for all of us to kind of think about and go, I had never thought about that until I read your story today, Chuck. So really want to dive into it. So you're listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there's a lesson in every story. We'll see you after the break.
Hello, listeners. I have some questions for you. Do you find yourself struggling with HR and employment issues? Are you afraid you could make the wrong employment decision that will cost your company thousands or even millions of dollars? Maybe you're new to the world of HR, or you've been in HR for a while and you just wish you had one resource, a guide to help you get HR right. Well, I've got good news for you. The team at HR Stories is excited to announce a new comprehensive resource, the Ultimate Book of HR Checklists. We created the Ultimate Book of HR Checklists as a simple, step-by-step resource guide packed with 70 downloadable checklists and other resources that help small businesses and organizations get human resources right. Even with very little HR or management experience, you can get instant results with concise, practical steps for addressing many of your tough employment issues. Do not miss out. Go to hrchecklist.com to learn more. That's hrchecklists with an S.com to learn more. And as always, thanks for listening to the HR Stories podcast, where the lesson is always in the story.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening to the HR Stories podcast. Today, we are talking about constructive discharge in our story. What does that mean? All right, and I think Chuck's going to define this for us. So Chuck, what's this story? Tell me more. People getting thrown in jail. I'm very confused. What's going on here? Tell me more.
Yeah, it's crazy stuff, John. And many times during our podcast and our many interactions with the classes, we teach on-site classes, in person, we teach a lot of virtual classes. We talk a lot about sexual harassment, and we talk a lot about retaliation, when someone's retaliated against for something that they've reported, or maybe the action of a supervisor, or something like that towards them. And we've also talked, and we bring up a concept called constructive discharge. But we've never talked about all three of them together. And today's story deals with these three topics of sexual harassment, retaliation, and constructive discharge, and how they're related and intersect with each other, and how companies need to listen, learn, and act based on what we talk about, not only in our classes, but here on the HR Stories podcast. So let's go back in time. And I know you love a good time travel story, as I do. All right, so let's get into our DeLorean, hit 88 miles per hour, and punch it. We're going to punch it. We're going to go back to 1998. That was a great year for the Supreme Court and a lot of sexual harassment laws that they saw. But this didn't happen in 1998 to the Supreme Court. That had to wait till 2004. But 1998, Nancy Drew Suiters, so just call her Nancy Suiters. She's a female police officer with the Pennsylvania State Police. She resigned from her job on a day in 1998 after enduring sexual harassment from her male supervisors. Nancy alleged that her supervisors made repeated unwanted sexual advances towards her, made sexually explicit comments and gestures. They created a hostile environment. And she also said, when I reported this harassment, I was retaliated against with increased scrutiny, ridicule, and discipline. She was a police officer, but I believe she was in like the dispatch area. She was a communications dispatcher for a certain region within the Pennsylvania State Police. But there's actually more to this story. It wasn't just a simple sexual harassment story. You see, it went further. Nancy also said her immediate supervisor withheld her test results, which affected her ability to complete her required training and made it more difficult for her to succeed on her job. So there were certain tests that she was taking that she could advance her career. And
so you're saying that, not to make clear, because sometimes I am amazed, right? I get like shocked, like what's going on? So you're saying that she took the test to move up to the next level, to get more training, and then her answers, her test was never passed on to the appropriate authority by her manager?
Exactly.
Wow.
So, and this is 1998. And I don't know if any of you can remember that. To me, 1998 is like yesterday. But when I look at pictures and things from 1998, I realize everything was still a lot of pen and paper. And these tests were pen and paper. And she did her digging around and she found out that her supervisors had falsely reported that she reportedly failed on these exams. And what she found out, the exams were never forwarded. So she found them actually in a drawer in the ladies' bathroom for some odd reason too.
Wait, what?
Yeah, I know that's a crazy part of the story, but that's where she found them. And she took them.
Was her boss female?
No, her boss was not female. That's the other crazy story. So
this is kind of crazy. Okay, yeah.
It did take some twists and turns. But 2 days after she complained to the Penn State Police Equal Employment Opportunity Officer, she was arrested because, and I know you're thinking, what? Well, here's this weird story. She finds these tests. She apparently she wasn't supposed to find them. She was digging around where she shouldn't have been digging around. They actually, her supervisor then has her arrested, booked, mugshot, and everything. They actually, get this, John, and this is just a little intricate part of the story. They actually, her supervisor had dusted it with some of this like evidence dust so that when she was looking for it, her hands were stained with this evidence ink.
So it sounds like he was setting her up.
Yes.
He was putting it in a place where she would find it if she did a little digging, putting a little this magic dust on it. So, oh my goodness. Okay, go on, more. I want more.
Yeah. So,
oh my God.
Well, it ends right there in a way because she quits, right? She quits. She files a lawsuit. And it moves forward. And the lawsuit, it was against the Pennsylvania State Police. And the trial court, the first court, found in her favor. And she won $300,000. But the decision was later reversed on appeal. So as we know, a lot of times these things progress through the court system. And eventually it ends up in the Supreme Court, and this is a landmark decision. This decision by the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court finds and holds that a constructive discharge claim can be proven if the employer intentionally, and I think you're alluding to this, it did sound like it, intentionally created intolerable working conditions with the intention of forcing the employee to quit.
Right? I mean, you think about that manager was like, all right, I'm going to set her up and I'm going to make sure that she does this. And then I'm going to harass her and I'm going to throw her in jail. One of the things I have to say, Chuck, I'll let you get back to the story. All I'm thinking is every single manager across the country is now like, can I arrest people? Can I put them in employment jail? The answer to that is no. Right? And so it amazes me. I don't want to say stupidity, but the hubris, right? The hubris of certain managers and businesses and agencies in this case that just don't really get it. All right. So what ended up happening at the Supreme Court?
Yeah. So the Supreme Court found that there was definitely sufficient evidence presented to establish genuine issue of what they call material fact as to she had been constructively discharged. And the interesting thing with this, the court clarified that an employee does not have to prove that they were subjected to the most severe and pervasive form of harassment and sexual harassment to establish a hostile work claim under Title VII. So it's significant because basically what the Supreme Court did was they clarified this concept called constructive discharge can be applied to Title VII, the Civil Rights Act cases, and it provided guidance for employers on how to prevent and address workplace harassment. And basically, the Supreme Court introduced constructive discharge. We talk about it today. And I got to tell you, when I bring it up in classes and I talk about, look, this is what, constructive discharge, some people think I'm joking. They think I'm making it up.
Wow. Yeah, well, I think what will help us all, Chuck, if you can give us some definitions around sexual harassment, retaliation, constructive, not disconstructive, constructive discharge in the workplace, because I'm still a little like, wait, what happened and what? Wait, so can you give me some definitions so I feel better and our listeners feel a little bit better?
Yeah, sure. So we both know sexual harassment, serious issue, affects a lot of people in the workplace. It takes a number of forms: sexual harassment, unwanted physical contact, offensive comments, jokes, and unfortunately, many targets of sexual harassment are afraid to come forward because they fear retaliation from their employer or coworkers.
And then, that makes sense, right? So sexual harassment really is that unwanted physical contact, offensive comments or jokes, that's severe and pervasive, right? And that's where we're going with this.
Yeah, and retaliation is a common problem in the workplace because it occurs when an employer takes adverse action against an employee who is engaged in what would be considered a protected act of activity, such as reporting sexual harassment. See, retaliation can take many forms, including termination, demotion, or negative performance reviews. And while we and our long-term listeners are familiar with these terms, many times participants in our class, and maybe some of our listeners, have never heard of constructive discharge.
So before you go on, let's go back to that retaliation, because there's a couple things you said in there that I just want to clarify, making sure that our listeners get. The first one is that retaliation can take many forms. And this is something that I know managers and HR people and leaders sometimes think, oh, retaliation means I terminated or I demoted them. But you put in there as an example of negative performance reviews, but it could also be, right? It could also be moving them into another location or putting them on second shift when they work on first shift, right? All of that could be considered retaliation, correct?
Yes. I might say, John, sweep the entire plant floor with this toothbrush.
And that would be retaliation, right?
Yeah. So, but constructive discharge, let's define that for our listeners. That's another issue that arises in cases of harassment and retaliation. It's directly related. It occurs when an employer creates working conditions that are so intolerable that a reasonable person would feel compelled to resign. They basically construct a situation, the manager or the company construct a situation specifically meant to target a particular employee. And it can be a difficult legal standard to meet, but it's important to understand the concept of constructive discharge, where an employee is forced to quit their job due to harassment and or retaliation. And some people may say, well, it was really hard work in there. They gave me all kind of work, and it was that may not be constructive discharge. Constructive discharge is a very specific targeting of one person with some crazy things, retaliation, all that stuff. And in fact, constructive discharge in the Me Too era has taken off a bit because the Me Too movement has led to increased constructive discharge claims, particularly in cases with sexual harassment. A lot of many employees who have been subjected to harassment or assault feel they can no longer work for their employer and choose to resign, which is a form of constructive discharge. A lot of employees now, John, are not just, oh, I'll grin and bear it. They are leaving.
Yeah. Right. And we see this in a lot of cases. I know we did a story, and I can't remember which episode it was, where there was a line cook who was being harassed by his fellow coworkers about his race and his gender. And that was constructive discharge as well. We talked about that a little bit in that story. Here's my question for you, Chuck. And I don't know, it's a kind of a legal question, so bear with me. Can this constructive discharge happen unintentionally? Can a manager or a company create a situation not intentionally to get rid of that person, but unintentionally where then that person still considers a target from their point of view? What do you think?
Could it happen? Sure. I mean, but you would have to then back it up and say, could they unintentionally retaliate against someone? Could they unintentionally sexually harass someone? And the answer to this question, sure, it could happen, but a lot of times it is an intentional thing. It is someone that gets offended or upset or takes it personally or has a vendetta, and they are coming at that person. So that's why at times it can be a difficult legal standard to apply, but it has been applied, especially in sexual harassment and retaliation cases. And in fact, I do have one more story where all of three of these are bundled together. It's a press release that just came out this past week. I want to talk about that and also just end our segment on this. I'm going to share that sometimes constructive discharge can go beyond sexual harassment, and I'll share some stories of where that has happened or examples.
Okay, well, let's take a break before you dive into that other story so everyone can kind of take a little break from us. You have been listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story. We'll take a break. Harassment at work continues to be a major issue. But do you know what to do when one of your employees tells you they have been harassed at work? The team at HR Stories is presenting a half-day workshop called Investigating Harassment Complaints. Registration information is in the show notes, or you can go to hrchecklist.com and register for our newsletter. Welcome back from the break, everyone. You have been listening to John and Chuck talk about constructive discharge. And I think Chuck's going to tell us a story now that's just a recent story, right, Chuck?
Yeah, this is a press release that came out from the EEOC this past week, and it caught my eye because I don't see a lot of cases where the headline is constructive discharge. So this is a group called Pacific Culinary Group and CB Foods. They're two companies that are involved in the sale, production, or distribution of Asian food products. They're based in Los Angeles. And keep in mind, John, this case is not settled. This is so there's a lot of terms in here like alleged and claimed. Okay, so this is
still being pursued by the EEOC in the court of law. We will probably hear something farther down, but it's a good story anyway to kind of talk about the principles that are happening.
Exactly. So the EEOC is saying that this company violated the federal law when they failed to prevent and correct. I see that all the time. Not only failed to prevent, but that correcting thing. Companies just don't get that part for some reason. They failed to prevent and correct sexual harassment and retaliation. According to the EEOC lawsuit, since at least 2020, Pacific Culinary and CB Foods subjected both female and male workers at their Monterey Park, California location to ongoing verbal and physical sexual harassment. The harassment allegedly perpetuated by their chief operating officer included, but was not limited to frequent and offensive groping, touching of bodies, unwelcome sexual advances, comments about their appearance, and inappropriate questions about employees' sexual preferences and sexual activities. And
that's crazy. I mean, that's just kind of crazy. Well, it's crazy. I'll comment later, but that's kind of crazy, and I have some comments to say, but I'll hold off.
Yeah, and once again, despite receiving multiple complaints of sexual harassment, the companies failed to take prompt and effective action. The sexual harassment continued, and it also said when employees objected to or reported the harassment, they were retaliated against with further harassment and or by discipline, including termination. The unlawful practices resulted in what the EEOC is calling intolerable work conditions, compelling some of the workers to quit.
Sounds like constructive discharge. But before you do that, I just want to go back to this story because I think a lot of our listeners are HR professionals and they are the only HR person in their organization, right? And sometimes when you're in that role and you have a leader, chief operating officer, who's doing this, you don't know where to turn. You don't know how to handle that situation, right? And I think giving them some advice, Chuck, I would say, look, if you're having that, first thing you have to do is have a conversation with that person saying, look, I'm getting all these sexual harassment complaints, blah, 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 blah. These employees are upset. And then go, look, here's the consequences. If you continue that behavior, one of these employees will go to the EEOC and make a complaint to the federal government, and they're going to come in and do an investigation of our company and could really hurt or damage how our company is run, right? Yeah. And having that conversation. And if that doesn't work, sometimes we have to make that choice and go, you know what? I'm not going to work at that company, which I know is easier there. But as HR professionals, we have to hold our companies to a high standard, even if that means sometimes going against leadership. And Chuck and I always say it, we are there to protect the company.
Yeah.
Not the leaders, the company. So
exactly. And it's funny, I tell this story in my class all the time. The CEO of a company was sexually harassing all the employees. The HR person goes and says something to the CEO. The CEO says, "Oh, the women love me. They all want me."
Oh, I know that story.
Yeah, they all want me. It was so bad that all the women in the office had secret codes when the CEO was coming. As to he's coming, knock, 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 this and that, everyone would scatter. Right. But getting back to this story, and those are all great points. You see, the EEOC is starting to add constructive discharge to a lot of these claims, but it's not only isolated to sexual harassment. For example, any retaliation against an employee can lead to constructive discharge claims. For example, if an employee reports illegal behavior or engages in any protected activity, like filing a complaint, but they report illegal behavior on the company and the employer, and it could be stealing or going against different laws, but the employer response is retaliation. They demote the person, they reduce their hours, they give them those negative performance evaluation. The employee may have a claim for constructive discharge. What about OSHA, John? Employees see an unsafe working condition, and they're required to work in this environment that's hazardous to their health and their safety. And the employer fails to address the issue despite repeated requests. The employee may have a claim for constructive discharge. And we're not saying the employee complained. We're just saying the employer is creating these hazardous conditions, not doing anything. The employee quits because of that. That could be constructive discharge. And a final example on non-sexual harassment is a change in duties or pay. If an employer just unilaterally just decides without any reason at all, maybe they just don't like this person for some reason, and they reduce their pay without justification, they make it impossible for the employee to do their job, earn a living wage, the employee may have a claim for constructive discharge. And along those lines, even a breach in an employment contract, if the employer breaches it, they don't pay promised bonuses or they don't provide promised benefits, they make it impossible for the employee to continue working for that employer, that employee could have a claim for constructive discharge.
Yeah, it's interesting because we have a right? As employers, I have a right to change my employee's salary whenever I feel like. that's right. It's built in there. We have that right. Obviously, there's some states we have to give them a certain level of notice. I also have a right to change their job duties as well. But if we're doing that in base of their complaint of a harassment or safety violations or all that kind of stuff, then there's the intent then is we're doing it because we want them to leave. We're setting it up. We're doing it as constructive discharge. We're creating an environment where they don't want to work. That becomes constructive discharge, and being really careful, especially if we're narrowing it down to one singular employee, right? So if there's, we make a decision that we're changing everyone's salary rates, all right, that's one thing. But if we're doing it just with one person, that's when we're going to get looked at a lot closer. And that's when we need to document, hey, this is why we're doing it. This is why we changed their duties. This is why we changed the responsibilities. And so again, documentation, everyone, is our friend, and making sure that we do that as well. Any last words, any final thoughts, Chuck? This was a really interesting story. When you told me you were going to do this constructive discharge, I was like, really? That's what you want to talk about? But I found it fascinating. I love the stories. I love the way you set it up. And I think there was a lot of good information to take away from this podcast today. So great job.
John, we've gone a long time today. It's been a long journey, but the bottom line is employers beware. Employers be aware of what your managers are doing. And that's
I think that's great, thought. Right? Yeah, right. Again, managers. I talk about it all the time. I'm passionate about it. For me, it's the middle managers that can help your company go really well, and it's your middle managers that are going to get you in trouble time and time if they're not trained, they're not there. One of the things I would recommend listeners is bring Chuck and I in to do classes for your managers and your supervisors about how the laws impact how they work. Right? And the way they have to do things. We can reinforce it. I know we have HR people here that are listeners, and they're like, we tell them all the time. Sometimes having an outside expert come in and kind of holding them a little bit accountable will move that needle where you need it to be. We'll work with you. We'll talk about, hey, this is what we need to say to them. These are the things we're troubled at. When we find those or having those connections, we see Chuck and I leave companies and they're like, yes, we're going to do this. We follow up in a month. They're like, yeah, it's going really well. 3 months, it's still going. And so definitely reach out to us for sure. Make sure you're connecting with us. If that's something that you need, we really want to be there.
Yeah. And folks, thanks for listening to the HR Stories podcast. Don't always remember, like, comment, subscribe. Check out the HR Team of One community on Facebook. And as always, check out our book, the Ultimate Book of HR Checklists, Getting HR Right. It's a step-by-step way to get through all of your HR and employee management situations. You can go to hrchecklists.com. Everything will be in the show notes. John, see you next week.
All right, I'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to the HR Stories podcast. The material presented in this podcast is for informational purposes only. Chuck and John always recommend using an employment lawyer or HR consultant to handle any legal concerns or HR issues. We do our best to double check sources and make sure the information we are providing is accurate. We may eliminate or embellish without changing the basic narrative to make the story easier to understand. In certain circumstances, we may change identifying information to protect the innocent. The HR Stories broadcast is brought to you by the team at HR Stories. The team at HR Stories is designed to help anyone with HR responsibilities be better at managing the employee experience. To engage with us, go to the hrstoriesteam.com and learn more about how the team at HR Stories can support your business or nonprofit. Thank you for listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story.